Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, namaskar and a very good morning. I do have a script here, which I think is quite important, some of the things. But you have raised some very relevant issues, which I hope that we'll be able to handle once I've given this special address. It is in fact a pleasure to be back in Sapru House to mark the forthcoming 70th anniversary of Malaysia-India ties. This is particularly special to me because the last time I was here, it was during Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's landmark speech on how we can leverage on Malaysia-India ties in a rising global south. Prime Minister Anwar's maiden state visit then was marked by our bilateral ties being upgraded to comprehensive strategic partnership, a milestone no less. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I hope to take a step back in order to be able to see more clearly ahead. Now, having played a role, however marginal it might have been, in the policy reset of our bilateral ties these past few years, as you mentioned, 2.5 to 3 years, let me state again at the outset, I am deeply committed to the future trajectory of Malaysia-India ties. Let me begin with the proposition that the bedrock of our contemporary ties has been the cultural and civilizational connect that our two nations share. What we have built thus far is owed to the people, the trust, the shared history, and the values that have shaped the foundation of our relations. These are the ties that bind. It is this foundation that allowed us to explore different avenues of cooperation. Those which tapped on our unique and indigenous growths and strengths, core interdependencies, and shared needs and priorities. We went a good few decades sticking to the playbook until we were confronted with a brief but pivotal interregnum in ties sometime in 2019. Since 2020, as a result of the brief shake-up, policymakers in Putrajaya and New Delhi have internalized that the partnership must be more calculated, more strategic, and more responsive to the realities of a dynamic geopolitical environment. Concomitantly, it must also be more impervious to existing irritants that are pending definitive resolution. This reset phase, therefore, must be understood as a period of purposeful recalibration, moving from comfort status quo to greater strategic intent. This evolution is best illustrated by the elevation of ties from enhanced strategic partnership to comprehensive strategic partnership. Such transitions should never be viewed as merely semantic or diplomatic embellishments. Rather, they signal a qualitative and holistic shift in ambition for how bilateral ties would be nurtured in the long run. In this context, Prime Minister Anwar's visit to New Delhi in 2014, as mentioned earlier, 2024, and thereafter Prime Minister Modi's visit to Kuala Lumpur earlier this year, unequivocally marked a defining milestone in the trajectory of relations. Nevertheless, we mustn't stop there, for there is an area in diplomacy where I would characterize as the terms of endearment between leaders. Hence, beyond the official communiques and even the ritual ceremonies of pomp and circumstance, the visits and bilateral tasks, and not the least the four-eyed meetings, projected that intangible but crucially significant air which could only emanate from political trust and personal camaraderie between our two eminent leaders. That is something that even the most astute or imaginative public relations exercise cannot project or manufacture. Either you have it or you don't. So in the area of international relations, optics matter because they shape perceptions. Narratives matter because they influence expectations. And messaging matters because it signals intent, not only to domestic audiences, but also to partners across the region. The warmth displayed during both visits conveyed that Malaysia and India are prepared to engage each other with confidence, candor, and strategic purpose. The Malaysia-India Comprehensive Strategic Partnership is therefore the very springboard from which the next chapter of relations will be built. In an era of perpetual geopolitical turbulence, it is perhaps the best mechanism on which to anchor our ties. At this juncture, let me hit the pause button for some critical introspection. As we laud the remarkable progress of Malaysia-India relations, we must also guard against the risk of complacency. Strategic engagement is as much about substance as it is about symbolism. The optics of a flourishing relationship is without doubt absolutely critical. Yet, riding on optics alone carries inherent hazards. It can create the impression that the relationship has reached a level of maturity that no longer requires sustained effort. Inertia could set in, both sides become comfortable with the narrative of success, while overlooking the harder task of delivering concrete outcomes. This also raises an important question about how we manage the more challenging aspects of relationship. Both our nations have generally preferred to compartmentalize certain issues in order to preserve momentum in other areas of cooperation. There is astute wisdom in this approach, of course, particularly when strategic interests converge. However, compartmentalization cannot become a permanent substitute for honest engagement. Even within Track 2 dialogues, there is often a tendency to avoid conversations that may be politically uncomfortable or diplomatically inconvenient. The question is not whether differences exist. They inevitably do between close partners. The question is whether our institutional architecture is sufficiently mature to address them without allowing them to define the relationship. Strategic partnerships derived from the resilience, not from the absence of disagreement, but from the capacity to manage disagreement constructively. Ladies and gentlemen, a related challenge is the persistent gap between aspiration and implementation. As the poet-philosopher T.S. Eliot reminds us, between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. Malaysia and India rarely lack ideas for collaboration, intent for cooperation in AI governance, green technologies, digital innovation, semiconductor ecosystems, and initiatives such as the India-Malaysia Startup Alliance all illustrate a shared recognition of future-oriented opportunities. But the difficulty lies in translating pronouncements into sustained action and tangible outcomes. Too often, declarations of intent outpace institutional follow-through. The credibility of the partnership will be judged by the number of initiatives that generate lasting economic and technological value. This points to another structural issue, and that is our cooperative mechanisms remain useful for sustaining dialogue, but they are less effective as instruments for evaluating the health of the relationship. Joint Commission meetings and other sectoral working groups provide valuable opportunities for consultation, yet they frequently measure activity rather than impact. As our relationship grows complexity, both countries may need more rigorous benchmarks that assess implementation, identify bottlenecks, and ensure accountability across institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, Malaysia and India should be cautious of what might be called the culture and civilization trap. The civilizational links between our societies are profound and deserve to be celebrated. They provide an invaluable foundation of familiarity, historical memory, and people-to-people connectivity. Yet, whether history could liberate or whether history could incarcerate, history alone cannot carry a 21st century strategic partnership. Nostalgia could well be a balm to our troubled and overstressed minds, or even provide the occasional spiritual upliftment. But it does not provide us with the machines to drive our ambitions. If our discourse remains dominated by references to ancient maritime links and shared heritage, we risk underinvesting in the contemporary drivers of national competitiveness. Technology, innovation, digital governance, advanced manufacturing, energy transition, and talent mobility. Do not get me wrong. Not for one moment do I propose to disparage the value and materiality of culture and tradition. But these affinities should be enablers of new forms of cooperation, not the ceiling that limits our imagination. Cultural heritage and traditional linkages should create tangible mechanisms that contribute to the enhancement of ties. At ISIS Malaysia, we have produced research that highlights shared culture and how this can be translated to cooperation in, for example, the textile sector, manufacturing, and even in performing arts and film sectors. This must be further explored, possibly through our CSP framework. Ultimately, the question before us is how to prepare and set Malaysia-India relations in order to strengthen our resilience to face the vagaries of the future. We need to frame relations as a process of straddling between interdependence and interoperability. The relationship against uncertainty and interoperability, and encourage reciprocity and better understanding of shared challenges, opportunities, and priorities. So what does that really mean? First, we need to, quote-unquote, strategize strategic ties. As the Malaysia-India relationship moves beyond its 7th decade, we must challenge the status quo and leverage frameworks built for today's economic realities. Nowhere is this more apparent than in high-value manufacturing, where our two economies act as natural complements rather than direct competitors. Malaysia brings decades of proven operational excellence, precise supply chain integration, and mature technical execution. India brings powerful upstream capabilities, powered by a massive world-class engineering and R&D workforce, alongside a rapidly expanding industrial footprint and a fast-growing domestic consumer market. Next, we must hold ourselves steadfast to the right normative anchor for mobilization. And that is our shared belief in the upliftment of the Global South. It was right here at Sapru House almost 2 years ago that Prime Minister Anwar said, and I quote, "Stronger Malaysia-India ties are consequential to a better connected Global South," unquote. So, the path is clear. Our commitment to mobilizing the Global South is the Catholic approach, both to enhancing bilateral ties intentionally and shaping a more inclusive public goods agenda for the benefit of all in the region. And here, I can invoke several mechanisms for this purpose, whether ASEAN mechanisms like the ASEAN Regional Forum or the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and even the International Big Cat Alliance, of which Malaysia is proud to be a founding member. Finally, in the context of the future trajectory of our bilateral ties, the question is, can shared principles provide the basis for a more durable Malaysia-India partnership? The answer, perhaps, is in the grand scheme of things, not to replace pragmatism with principles, but to allow principles to reinforce pragmatism. The Malaysia-India relationship has traditionally been driven by converging interests. While this approach has delivered tangible benefits, interests can evolve with changing political priorities and economic circumstances. Shared principles, by contrast, offer greater continuity. Malaysia and India may not agree on every regional or global issue, but they do share important convictions: respect for sovereignty, strategic autonomy, peaceful dialogue, an inclusive regional architecture, commitment to multilateralism, and the belief that stability is best preserved through cooperation rather than coercion. To my mind, anchoring the relationship in this common nexus would provide a stronger foundation for navigating inevitable differences, while fostering greater trust and policy consistency. In that sense, principles should not be viewed as an alternative to pragmatism, but as the normative compass that gives strategic cooperation greater resilience and durability over time. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, the Malaysia-India relationship is in essence not only consequential to both our nations, but our region as a whole. There is comfort in the idea that this is a relationship we can always go back to in dire times. Indeed, the times, they are a-changing, as the song goes. But they have been changing since time immemorial. So let us not criticize what we don't understand. Let us not patronize what we don't own. And let us not judge lest we be judged. In times like these, perhaps we need to fall back on the wisdom of Wittgenstein's famous mantra: whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But we do have something to say still, and that is our aspiration. It is the hope that for Malaysia in the 70 and beyond, to be a relationship that will thrive in good times and that will be resilient in the bad. Time is not measured by the passing of years, but by what one does, what one feels, and what one achieves. The very words of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So, in that vein, let me close by saying that on such an aspiration, we will build towards the next era of Malaysia-India ties. Thank you.